Hello, everyone. Thank you for spending your lunchtime with us and joining us for this Lunch to Learn. We're going to be discussing, providing an introduction to medical device security, in particular, a regulatory overview. My name's Alan Parkinson. I'm Managing Director of Hindsight Software. We make a compliance assistant called 𝗬𝗲𝗄. I've got 25 years experience in software engineering. I've worked in safety critical systems and high integrity systems, particularly in finance, so heavily security focused there. And in the last 13 years, I've been helping software engineering teams improve their requirements and verification processes. And I was asked by a medtech company to teach some of their teams these new processes. And now for the last 2 years, I've been focused on medtech. I'd like to introduce Heather, who's joining me on this call.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Heather Carre-Skinner. I am a scientist by trade with a PhD in molecular microbiology. I did a couple of postdocs, but then decided to move into the world of compliance for medical devices, which I've been doing for about 17 years now. I've worked with all sorts of different types of companies, and for the last 8 years or so, I've mainly worked with a lot of software companies, software-based companies. And then 3 years ago, I set up on my own as an independent consultant.
It's just to note that these series of webinars, because this is just the introduction, are for educational discussion purposes. They don't constitute consultancy. Every medical device project is different. I'm sure each of yours is going to have different requirements. But a quick run through. So we're doing an introduction today, but then we're going to, over the course of the next 3 or 4 months, dive into deeper topics. So we're going to cover the software supply chain, sort of 𝗬𝗲𝗵, and your look at the management. Then we're going to look at threat modeling and risk management. And then we're going to focus on security testing and verification. But to start off, what is cybersecurity? So I've taken this definition from the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. Most countries have an equivalent. They are a really useful source of information and advice when the regulations don't provide any. So cybersecurity's core function is to protect the devices we all use. So most people will think this would be smartphones, laptops, tablets, and computers, and the services we access with them, both online and at work. And it's particularly to protect them from theft or damage. So in the medical device context, laptop or smartphone is replaced with your medical device. Could be SIMD, and then the services could be where they store data. So if you provide a lot of processing on the cloud, or it could be the patient data, where's the patient data storage, and then theft or damage. So most people will think of stealing patient information, but devices could be damaged, which then puts people's lives at risk. So that's one that's forgotten quite a bit.
So if we think about what the current issues are regarding cybersecurity in medical devices, so traditionally medical devices have had little or no involvement with software, and SAMD is relatively recent in its innovation if we think about wearables and smartphones as apps, etc. And also devices are now connected more than ever into things like patient electronic health records, for example. And devices themselves and companies consequently use patient and user data. And this has become a big business in itself. And these few factors have really sort of brought about a big learning curve. So certainly when I started out in my sort of quality regulatory journey, I didn't know anything about software. So, and that's the same for a lot of compliance teams. So they're playing catch up on software knowledge and consequently cybersecurity knowledge as well. And also, we're not dealing with simple devices here, connected devices can be part of a very complex ecosystem. And this has also led to a lot of gaps in risk management activities. So as we all know well from sort of the compliance side of devices, medical devices are always linked with patient safety. That's just the number one thing. But also we need to start thinking about cyber secure devices as well, which is also, really inherently linked to patient safety as well as that data safety as well.
Just to add a comment on Heather experience with regulatory teams and compliance teams, not only having to get familiar with cybersecurity recently, 25 years ago in software engineering, we didn't talk about cybersecurity often. And it's only really 15 years ago, it slowly started to get momentum. And it's really the last 7 or 8 years that a lot of innovation in this area has actually been done. So it's not just the software, it's not just compliance teams that have had to catch up. Software is still catching up too, the software development teams.
Yeah, that's a really important point you make there.
Yeah, education is going to be key. Doesn't matter what your background. So Heather's already touched on it, and security is safety. So in cybersecurity, we have the CIA triad, which stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So confidentiality, that is often what people think of in cybersecurity is stealing people's data, stealing patient data. But you can actually directly impact the integrity of a medical device and change the results and its reliability. If you think the time we spend on soup and looking at the risks of bringing in software and it could be that software gets compromised and that affects the integrity of your device. All that risk management you've done on that suddenly goes out the window. Also, the availability of the device. If it's no longer available, a clinician can't use it, how does that impact patients? So 2 NHS trusts actually got impacted by a pathology company, 𝗪𝗵𝘆, getting attacked in June last year. Oh, sorry, August was the actual attack. But what happened was over 1,600 elective procedures had to be cancelled. 10,000 acute outpatient appointments had to be postponed. And when you've got a backlog, that's a significant problem. But this actually had resulted in 4 London boroughs reporting 2 cases of major harm from those delays, and 11 cases of moderate harm and 120 cases of minor harm. So it actually has a direct consequence. And this wasn't an actual medical device, this was just a lab service. So there's a few cybersecurity myths. So when these are quite common when I actually have a conversation with compliance teams or medical device manufacturers. So devices without a network connection don't need to follow cybersecurity rules. So you could have a device, it's got a USB port and you use that USB port to update the firmware. You need that capability to update it in case you've got to fix a safety issue. But how can an attacker use that USB port? I could put in a USB device and try and access files. I could put a network connection in via the USB port to try and interface with the device. Previously, it didn't have a network interface. I could be accessing, putting a keyboard in to make changes to the device. There's lots of ways I could use that USB port. So the FDA actually do look to see if you've considered it. They'll consider it a low-risk device, but they want to see that you've considered these different options and you've actually secured the device.
I would also, sorry, Alan, I would also add to your first point about the FDA, who are really quite hot on cyber, as we all well know, is that even if the device itself isn't currently connected, if it has the potential to be connected, then it still needs to follow those cyber rules.
Yes, so true. So Bluetooth as well is another example.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you're doing SAMD, it's all based in the cloud. Perhaps you're analyzing images. one common one I've come across is our cloud provider implements security. Now, cloud providers have what's called a shared security model, is where they document what they are responsible for security-wise. So they will do the low-level patches, perhaps to the operating system and the hardware and lower down. But they'll also document what you are responsible for configuring. You are using their service, you can configure it in an insecure way, which accidentally leaves all data exposed. So they'll also provide documentation on what you're responsible for. And I've got some tips later on this particular myth and how to deal with it. And the final one is security updates must go through change control and review by the FDA or notified body for release. Yes, you have to go through your internal change control when releasing a security update, but getting a review by the FDA or notified body is only required when the change would actually have an impact on safety. So that's where you need to use your software architecture and actually look at the impact of, say, having to do an update because a piece of soup's got an identified vulnerability. You've got to work out actually how does this impact your device, whether it's going to be a quick security update or do you need to actually get a review. There's quite a bit of different legislation driving cybersecurity. Not all it's legislation, some of it is guidance. So we've looked at 3 geographies here. So in the top left, we have the USA, top right, EU, and at the bottom, we've got the UK. The outer ring represents general cybersecurity standards or legislation. So in the US, we have SOC 2, but then in the UK and the EU, the equivalent would be ISO 20001. Quite often, contracts will require you to have one of these standards. But also in the EU, you have GDPR, driving protections and rules on how you store and use process data. But then EU's brought in NIS2, which is a set of cybersecurity rules for companies of a certain size or economic importance. So these are all can provide requirements, but they're not going to be looked at from, say, the notified body or the FDA's point of view. But you could have them as part of your commercial requirements. Now, if we look right in the center, at the dark blue, we've got the direct FDA security guidelines. We've got MDR, so MDR Annex 1. And then we've got the UK with its sort of legacy MDD-based rules. Now, because of the UK's legacy MDD-based rules, we actually have a problem for the NHS that they need security. So there's actually 3 different sets of standards you need to consider if you're going to supply the NHS. We've got DTAC, which is the digital assessment criteria, and security is one of those. We also have the clinical safety, so DCB 0129, and then there's a data safety toolkit as well, so DSPT. So if you're doing UK and going to supply the NHS, you need to look at those. Well, the notified body's not going to look at those. You'll have to have all these to actually get approval from a trust. MDR, there's 2 sets of different guidance, which we're going to cover in a moment. So we've got the MDGC and the IEC 81001. And in the US, we've got HIPAA. So HIPAA will be providing a lot of security requirements if your device stores patient data or accesses patient data. So these all influence the requirements on your medical device.
Okay, so we'll have a look now a little bit more about regs and guidance, etc. So in the EU MDR, Alan, correct me if I'm wrong, I think they mention security about 4 times, and only once do they actually refer to in terms of it manufacturing. So in Annex 1, we have software will to be developed and manufactured in accordance with state of the art, taking into account principles of development lifecycle risk management, including information security. There we go. 3 magic words. Verification and validation. So let's have a look a bit more into that. So what is state of the art for MDR in terms of cybersecurity? So We have the 𝗬𝗲𝗃 guidance, cybersecurity for medical devices. This looks at secure design and manufacture, what you need to include in documentation and the IFU, as well as guidance on post-market surveillance and vigilance. However, there is also another standard, IEC 81001 Part 5, which is very robust, and it outlines security activities in product lifecycle. So this is essentially the security version of IEC 62304. And the new version, well, that's in draft at the moment on the BSI website, it actually explicitly references this 81001 standard. And annoyingly, there is within the EU there is delayed harmonisation of this standard. It was supposed to be last year, but it's been pushed back to 2028.
Yeah, so just to clarify, Annex 1, it was mentioned it 6 times, but Heather's completely right. On manufacturing, it only mentioned it once, and 3 of the other times it mentions security is actually on sort of intended use and labelling. So MDR very much focused on pre-market, didn't even think post-market surveillance, but that has changed with advice that's been issued since then. So what's happened because of 81001 being delayed for harmonisation, the European Association of Medical Device Notified Bodies actually issued a position paper in 2022, and they consider the standard as state of the art. But they also recognise that it's going to be difficult for manufacturers to suddenly change. So they really want manufacturers to be starting that transition if they can, already completed that transition, or can show that they're going to complete it by the transition period. But the other problem notified bodies has got is they're actually trying to upskill in so many different ways at the moment. So we've got AI, we've got SAMD, and now we've got cybersecurity. They are having to upskill quite quickly. So what I have observed looking at a number of different approvals over the last 18 months is what questions you get asked about cybersecurity from a notified body varies between the notified bodies, varies between countries, varies between individuals within the same notified body. So you can get away with just doing the MCGD guidelines, or you're going to get asked questions and they'll want you to do 81001, which makes collecting what rules you do a little bit difficult.
Yeah, so we'll touch very quickly on our friends over the pond in the US. So with the FDA, they've always, I would say, been a little bit one step ahead of the curve in terms of cybersecurity. So their main guidance from the FDA was released in the final one was released in 2023, which is cybersecurity in medical devices, quality system considerations, and content of pre-market submissions. It does exactly what you think it is. So it very much looks at secure product development framework, security requirements, risk management, security architecture, as well as testing in a robust way. And this really does align and is harmonised with the IEC 81001. So if we look a bit more into the golden child, that is 81001.5, so this is standard lines to 14971 management standard and 62304 software development for medical devices. As I said, it really looks at security within the risk management framework, looking at risks to the device as well as risks to confidentiality, integrity, availability of data, as well as threat modeling. So it really does sort of pin down this sort of secure software development life cycle or secure product development framework. And this looks at as well as building it and looking at risks. It looks at the supply chain, the software delivery materials, and also really sort of taking manufacturer's responsibility, whereby you are looking at your vendors and looking at that security assessment. This is also identifying is one thing. It's also implementing them as well. So these are also built into requirements for your device. So looking at topics and such as access controls. So how does the user log into the device? Is it 2FA? Those sorts of things. Encryption, what level of encryption is used? Is data protected in transit, rest, and also integrity of the code. So we're looking at coding techniques, the way data is managed, and the way that the code is executed as well. And also, probably most importantly as well, is post-market requirements. So as we all know, with the bolstering of all the BMS requirements now, anything you do with a medical device has to be ongoing. So this is ongoing monitoring of cyber risks. We're not just thinking about attacks that have happened to customers or potential customers and clients. This is very proactive in that you're looking at databases which can inform about recent attacks. So looking at something like a similar device, looking at how your device will be patched if need be, as well as software updates. So this is part of the maintenance plan for a software device. And also an incident response and disclosure plan as well. So we've sort of learned about what happens when a device goes wrong or a patient is put into harm, but we also need to start thinking about data as well. If the device is linked to a lot of patient data, who needs to be informed? Is it like the Information Commissioner's Office, for example, in the UK?
So Heather mentioned a secure software development lifecycle. So this is the typical V model that you'll see related to IEC 62304. So it should be familiar to everybody here. But what activities do we need to do to make it a secure software development lifecycle? We're not adding new stages. But there are new tasks and new documents that we need to provide. So if we start in the top left-hand corner with our software requirements. So one of those is security requirements. Heather's already mentioned access controls and other requirements. These are quite often in the annex of certain standards. So they're in the annex of the FDA's cybersecurity guidance, but also you would get controls from, say, HIPAA or SOC 2 or ISO 27001, but also your customers would also, it could be clinicians and their organizations would actually have their own security requirements. So that's where you get a lot of that information from. So we also have security risk management. So we're very much looking at what threats are there, what impact are they, so how exploitable are they, what mitigation can we do to avoid them, and does that mitigation provide enough reduction in the risk? And this is done by something called threat modeling. There's a systematic way of doing that. And this very much ties into software architectural design and heavily influences it. So quite often you need to do data flow diagrams because security issues generally follow the data, how it goes through the system. You can look at identifying trust boundaries, having effective segregation in your architecture, what privileges each software item need to run as. But the key part from this is you need to do a security review. You actually need to look and consider your threat model. Has the architecture addressed it all? Are new threats there because of your architecture? It's a very iterative process between your threat modeling, risk management, and your architecture. Doesn't mean you need to do this in a waterfall way where you do all your architecture up front. You can still do it in an incremental way where you're doing threat modeling, a small amount of threat modeling each sprint, but also you could do it every few months. Detailed design. If we've selected certain bits of soup, we may look to see if there's any best practices around using that soup. So it'd be something like a web framework. So you could, for an example, Express. There's security guidelines for that. You would then need to implement those security guidelines, add them to your secure programming guide for your developers to follow during development. And then that comes right through into verification. You need to do a secure code review. So you'd have your standard code review and you would add some additional rules and elements to look at relating to security. And that will be influenced from any best practices for security or for your soup or your programming language. That can be also built on top of with your static analysis. You can also, so if you're doing any static analysis and linting as part of verification, you can also add security-based static analysis on top of that. And then we've also got the SBOM creation, so creation of your bill of materials. People get quite worried about this one, but that's actually quite simple to do, and we're going to cover that in another webinar. And then further up with our verification and moving into validation, we've got penetration test, which is another requirement, and it's required to be done by an independent qualified organization. We've got dynamic analysis, and vulnerability testing. So they're very much part of the same category. So you can use tools to do fuzzing on all your interfaces with your device, look at ways that is data being checked before it's being processed, it doesn't cause a security issue. You also need to show your tests that relate, that trace back to your threat mitigation. You've got to show all your traceability for your threat modeling, just like any safety risk. Your threat modeling and your security risk assessment is just like safety. You need to show traceability throughout. And then you might have some anomalies left over. These would hopefully be quite low, and you would need to analyze and have a justification for leaving them there. So just a few updates to your QMS, Heather.
Yeah, so the big one is requirements. So build in security by design practices and develop a defense strategy to your product. So if you are following the standards, then you'll be looking at security management planning, specification of your security requirements. Again, what Alan said, you don't necessarily need to have all of these up front. It can be done in an iterative way. Thinking about security in the architecture, so having a good idea of data flow, data movement, looking at the vulnerabilities there and getting some security in place. Actually implementing it, doing it, and then also testing it. And then how you are going to manage any updates and integrate any new security guidance as well. Obviously, risk management will need to be updated. So think about planning security and your device together. You may have two separate teams, or you may be looking at this together, but they do need to be looked at in concert. think about your threat modeling as well as part of your risk management activities. And as we've already said, use the requirements and the annexes in 81001 because they've got some good nuggets in there. You will also need to think about updating reporting requirements. So how you are going to communicate with the customer in terms of a data breach, for example, as well as other authorities such as the ICO. And as we've already touched on, as well as a physical bill of materials, well, you may also have a software bill of materials there as well. Also, it's worth thinking about some good stuff from ISO 27001 with a business continuity plan. So it doesn't have to be incredibly formal, but having a good idea of if the worst does happen and there is a hack, for example, what do you do? Who needs to be informed? Getting a succession plan is a good idea. Also dealing with legacy software as well. One of the annexes in 81001 does have some good stuff in there as well to deal with that. Also, training is a big one to do. So as well as, sort of learning about 13485, etc., as a normal medical device manufacturer, also start learning about security and sort of assessment programs as well. So for the UK, Cyber Essentials is a really good one as well. Adding secure development into continuous improvement is a very good idea. So looking at the number of identified vulnerabilities that were updated or patched, looking at when the vulnerability was first identified until it was dealt with, and also thinking about the duration of when an update is available to actually implementing it in devices as well. And as we mentioned, post-market surveillance, really honing in on threat and vulnerability intelligence and what that means to your device. So have a look at websites which sort of detail cyber threats such as 𝗦𝗲𝗃 and the National Cybersecurity Centre. And just to finish, I think most of that's covered actually. There we go.
So earlier on, I mentioned some cybersecurity myths. I particularly mentioned our cloud provider implements security for us, and I just wanted to provide some advice on that because my background is software engineering, not the regulatory compliance, but I want to make software engineering productive while being compliant. So I've got a few insights on this. So we've got cloud with its shared responsibility model. You do need to learn about that. But one of the things is the FDA will particularly consider this. Notified bodies are a bit variable on asking about this, is wanting evidence that you've actually configured your cloud environment in a secure way. Are you following best practices on this? So all the major cloud providers do issue guidance on how to secure each of their services. And quite a few of them will provide tools so you can automatically check the configuration, and it can alert you to the sort of most critical and high security issues. It'll even go down to moderate or low, but obviously it's up to you to decide at what level you follow this guidance. But there's also independent guidance. So CIS also provide a series of guidance on how to use, say, configure Docker, how do you configure AWS. So they're all good to follow. So we at Hindsight, we use AWS as our cloud, and they have a product called Security Hub for looking at all these rules. But all these major cloud providers like AWS have partners. In particular, we use an AWS partner to something called a well-architectured review. And if you are currently getting a bill with Amazon and paying a bill with Amazon, I highly recommend getting a well-architectured review. One of the options is a security lens, where the partner will look at your AWS configuration and then they will make recommendations against those best practices. Now, Amazon will then pay you $5,000 of credits per workload to actually have the partner fix those issues for you. Now, if you do this right, you can actually make that cost neutral for you. So you get credits towards your Amazon bill, but you pay the partner. So you can actually make this cash flow neutral for you. And this is a trick I highly recommend startups doing, because you get a lot of security advice and configuration of your cloud for you done by qualified professionals, and it works to be cost neutral. Another aspect that comes often, gets raised often, is cybersecurity is expensive. It doesn't have to be expensive. So a lot of your existing tools will already have security features where you can pay either a little bit more, or there's an open source equivalent for. So if you've got GitHub, there's a feature called 𝗪𝗵𝘆, which can build your software bill of materials and then monitor your software bill of materials. It literally takes 2 minutes to turn on. Obviously, you need to evaluate whether it meets your programming language and other requirements, but it's a really quick win at no additional cost. If you're using a linting tool, there are probably additional rule sets for it. Some of those will be security based, and you can select those and implement those. Again, it doesn't take long to do. Another mistake I see people do is actually hire a complete separate security team. That security team will have, if you throw everything from development over to security team, they're going to have to learn what's in the developers' heads to do a good job. Security should be a whole responsibility. Now, from the standards point of view, you need somebody who's independent of software development to be in charge of security, but it doesn't mean you can't train people in threat modeling, software development best practices on security, and get everybody working on security. You just need that one independent person. And if you're a small medical device provider, it doesn't have to be a full-time position. It could be a security consultant working on a 1 or 2 day a month basis. So it doesn't have to be expensive. The biggest one would be leaving security to the end. If you don't implement a lot of this in the secure development lifecycle, one, you're going to get asked for it later on. So you're going to have to go back and implement it. Two, it'll actually mean there's a lot of security issues that get through to your pen test, to your penetration test. This independent report you need to be done. So when the pen test happens, quite often you will get the opportunity, you'll get the initial report with security findings. You'll be given the opportunity to go away, fix those findings, and then they will retest to make sure you fix those. So that retest costs money. So the more issues they find later on, the more money it costs. So it's actually good to get your security done up front. Also, I mentioned architecture earlier, and architecture is quite key for security. If an issue is found in your architecture, that's an expensive piece of rework. So I'd actually suggest starting to implement security now.
Okay, so in summary, first take-home message would be don't be scared. I speak from experience from learning software. It is a bit daunting, but get over it and get over yourself and learn, because it's not going to go away. Security terminology may be different, but the underlying concepts are the same, which is safety, safety to the user, safety to the patient. Also, by embracing cybersecurity means improving device safety. So this is good for the company. And also future-proof yourself, the team and the device by really embracing 𝗬𝗏 Part 5, because it looks like it's going to be just the most adopted standard there.
Yeah, don't forget to build security into your software development lifecycle. Start today, even if it's just monitoring your soup items for vulnerabilities using GitHub 𝗪𝗵𝘆. You can start fixing these issues today and avoiding the cost later on, avoiding questions from the notified body or the FDA later on and rework having to be done. It doesn't have to be expensive. Use some of those tips or tricks join us for later webinars for further tips and tricks and when we deep dive on individual topics. But it doesn't have to be as expensive as you imagine. You don't need to buy fancy tools. There's a lot of open source tools out there. There's a lot of tools that you're already using that actually have security functionality. And if you could only do one thing on security, I'd say start threat modeling. Understanding where your risks are, what your security requirements are, and start building those into your medical device and start mitigating those risks. That will have probably the biggest return on investment. So we have time for questions. Myself and Heather will stay online to answer your questions. If we can't answer them right now, we'll answer them later on. So do put your questions in and we'll get to them. While you're thinking up a question, just a recap of our webinar series. So on the 20th of March, again at lunchtime, we're going to be focusing on the software supply chain. And this is going to focus on doing your vendor assessments, your software bill of materials. So what tools to use or how to evaluate tools, but then also your post-surveillance of your software bill of materials. How can you actually identify and then start remediation of those vulnerabilities? And then in April, we're going to be covering threat modeling and risk management. So identify those threats, what can you do to mitigate them? Have you reduced that mitigation down? So we're going to go into that in depth. And I highly recommend this because it's good to train everybody in the team on this, get everybody involved in threat modeling, because you want the people who build it to be involved because they'll have an insight. And then the final one is your security testing and your sort of verification activities. So we'll look at some of the linting and the static analysis, what to get in a pen test, you know, what providers to use, what the rules around that, but also how to make the most of them. So we'll be looking at that in May. Also, the MHRA are going to be issuing security guidance later in the year for the UK. So we'll also have a follow-up webinar for that. So thank you for your time.
Are there any questions in the chat, Alan?
I'm just waiting.
Okay.
Do just pop the questions into the LinkedIn chat. Perhaps you've got a burning question, something you don't understand about cybersecurity, you need it answering now. We can try our best.
Whilst we're waiting for some people to think of some questions, if they have any, what do you think in the future is going to be the biggest sort of cyber risk to devices? Is there something coming like we haven't thought about yet?
So ransomware is quite a popular attack at the moment. So ransomware is disabling or stealing or locking away files and demanding a ransom for it to be unlocked. And having good encryption and things like that is a good way of stopping that, stopping yourself becoming a victim to that. What's going to happen is, I think there's going to be some high-profile incidents. So in cybersecurity, there's something called pivoting. So where I can use a vulnerability in one piece of software to get access to something else, and then I find a vulnerability in that, and I can chain these vulnerabilities. Say I could use a vulnerability in a medical device to get into a hospital's network and get me a certain level of privilege of that network, and I could do something else with that. That's quite an important one.
I think one thing I sort of worry about, so there's a lot of bringing the hospital to home, so there's a lot of connected more and more connected devices being used by people at home, and be that for physical rehabilitation or whatever. But I kind of worry about the older generations using this sort of tech. I mean, I'm not talking about not necessarily just about like aging father or anything like that, but also when I get older, is that tech going to be so kind of advanced that if you're not down with the kids, keeping up with everything, you're sort of being forced to use these sort of devices at home, and you're like, I don't really know how to use it. I'm like going to say accept to things, and suddenly you're saying yes to like a ransomware attack. And so I really sort of feel like usability is also going to become such a key thing for a lot of this at home use, and just when it is in the hands of a layperson, essentially.
You're completely right, and it does come down to usability. At the moment, there's a lot about sort of labeling and documentation on intended use and what the environment is for a medical device, and getting people to get a layperson to read that would be quite hard. So usability, if you're sort of in SAMD and it's going onto somebody's mobile phone device, you might want to start thinking about, is there some security checks that we can do, making sure that the phone hasn't been jailbroken or it's got malware on it.
No.
You can start to think about those. There's going to be some high profile incidents. We're going to get new guidance at some point. Another situation, there was an open source library that got taken over 2 years ago by another developer, and they slowly injected malicious code. That's going to come more. That's going to happen more often to soup. There's something that's starting to get a lot of momentum in the last year, which is actually verifying the soup you've got. So if you use a library, what's the provenance of that library? It's on a library management system or a package management system, and you're consuming it from there. But is it the original version that matches to the source code? So there's a lot of work on digital signatures and manifests to actually provide traceability to make sure it's actually come from who it says it comes from. And that's being able to intercept libraries and get a essentially tampered with version of the library into a medical device would be a good attacking route. And the important thing to think is your medical device might not be the intended target. It could be just collateral damage. Somebody could be targeting a particular hospital. Your device has the same vulnerability as other systems there, and your device goes down along with the rest of the hospital systems that were the original target. So it's a wide field. We're going to get a lot of new guidance over the years, but it's all risk-based.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for everybody for your time, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thanks, everyone.